What immediately came to my mind was something called the minimal facts approach, and I learned it from a man named Gary Habermas. I want to share that with you right now because I think it's something that will be helpful to you as you begin to engage with people about the resurrection. There are 5 minimal facts, and the first one is this: Jesus' death on the cross. Jesus' death on the cross is one of the bedrock facts of the historical Jesus. Virtually every critical scholar will agree that Jesus died on the cross. In fact, John Dominic Crossan, who was a professor in the very skeptical Jesus seminar in the 90s, even he says that he was crucified of Jesus, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. First, not only do we have the gospel reports, but we have outside the Bible Josephus, a Jewish historian who writes about this in Antiquities. There are parts of this passage that have been tampered with by Christians, but the authentic parts does say that Jesus was crucified. He says, when Pilate, upon hearing him, that's Jesus, accused by men of the highest standing among us, had him condemned to be crucified, and he goes on. And so Josephus, that's a Jewish source talking about the Jewish involvement in Jesus being handed over to the Romans. Number 2 is Tacitus. This is a Roman historian. A Roman historian talking about Rome's involvement in Jesus' crucifixion. He says, Nero fastened the guilt of the burning of Rome and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations. Called Christians by the populace, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And the extreme penalty is a euphemism for crucifixion. So we have a Jewish source talking about the Jewish involvement in Jesus' crucifixion. We have a Roman source talking about the Roman involvement in Jesus' crucifixion. We have Lucian of Samosata. This guy wasn't a stand-up comedian, but he was a Greek satirist. And he talks about the Christians, to this day, they worship a man, that distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. Number 4 is Mara bar Serapion. And so he's writing to his son from prison, and he says, what advantage came to the Jews by the murder of their wise king, seeing from that very time their kingdom was driven away from them? Number 5 is the Talmud. This is much later, but the Talmud is a Jewish rabbinical text that reflects Jewish discussions. And it says, on the eve of Passover, Yeshua was hanged. And Yeshua is Jesus, hanged as a euphemism for being crucified. These 5 minimal facts, fact number 1, 2, 3, and 4 actually, virtually every critical historian will agree that these are facts of history. Now the 5th fact is going to be one that only about 75% agree to, but still the overwhelming majority of New Testament critical historians will grant the historicity of these facts. So you can be confident that Jesus was in fact crucified. This is no myth. The crucifixion of Jesus is a historical event. Fact number 2. Fact number 2 is that Jesus' disciples really believed that they saw him alive after he was publicly executed. Okay. So fact number 2, the disciples' belief that they saw Jesus alive after his crucifixion. No critical historian will disagree with the idea, virtually nobody will disagree with the idea, that Jesus' disciples had real experiences that they believed were real experiences of the risen Jesus. So just because they believed it, it doesn't make it true, but what this means is these guys weren't lying. They weren't lying. They weren't trying to trick anybody. We know that they claimed it. Paul told us that he knew them personally, right? Paul said they were claiming Jesus rose. In 1 Corinthians 15, 3-11, Paul says, whether it's me or them, what we proclaim is this. It's the same thing. It's Jesus' resurrection. Then we have this oral tradition from 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. This is a Christian creed that was written way before the New Testament documents were written, way before even 1 Corinthians was written in 55 AD or 56. And so we can see that this is really, really ancient, very ancient. So Paul had to have the understanding of this theology of Jesus' resurrection, even when he had his Damascus Road experience 2 years after the cross. And he had to know about this when he persecuted the church for their belief in Jesus' resurrection. So this is an ancient creed. And this creed says that Jesus appeared to his disciples and to others. But the core theology goes back to before Paul, to even before his resurrection. Now we're talking about within a few months to a year of Jesus' crucifixion. Finally, we have written documents. We have the Gospels. We have Clement, the Bishop of Rome, and Polycarp, the Bishop of the Church of Smyrna. And these are first century documents. So this is well attested. Jesus' disciples' belief that they saw him alive after his crucifixion is a well attested fact. We know they claimed it, but besides that, we know they really believed it. Not only did they claim it, we know they actually believed it. Why? Because they were transformed to the point where they were willing to suffer and die for saying that Jesus personally appeared to them. People die for all kinds of causes. But the difference here is that these people, Jesus' disciples who claimed they saw him, they were dying for their personal testimony that they personally saw Jesus. Not for some tradition that was handed down that they heard about. They were dying for their personal testimony that they themselves saw Jesus alive after his public execution. They were the only ones to know whether they really saw Jesus or not. Liars make lame martyrs. People might die for what they think is true, but nobody will die for what they know is a lie. Number 3. Fact number 3 is the conversion of the persecutor, Paul. Remember, Paul wasn't always a missionary. Paul was Saul of Tarsus, chief Pharisee who was in charge of persecuting the church. But Paul suddenly became a Christian. Now the question is, why would somebody who persecuted the church turn around and become a Christian and begin promoting the very message she was trying to eradicate off the face of the earth? If you asked Paul, he would tell you it's because he had an experience with the risen Jesus. We have the Galatian report in Galatians chapter 1. Within 3 years of the time that Paul became a Christian, there was a story going around about him in Judea. 3 years after he became a Christian, no one in Galatia knew what he looked like, but they were told that he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he tried to destroy. And so Christians in Galatia, some of them were suspicious of him. Luke wrote in Acts about how Paul, Saul of Tarsus, right, persecuted the church, was even involved in the murder of the first Christian martyr of Stephen. And Paul's conversion story is told 3 times here. So we have the Acts report as well. That's another source. So that's Luke. And then Paul's own report, he himself wrote why he became a Christian. Why would someone who persecuted the church suddenly become a Christian? He saw Jesus. And so Paul's report is a good piece of evidence. He was an enemy of the church. It wasn't like he missed Jesus so much. Like sometimes people will say, well, the disciples, Jesus' friends, they just missed him so much, and so they kind of started seeing him around everywhere. But Paul didn't miss Jesus. Paul certainly never wanted to see him again. But Paul, an enemy of the Christian church, became one of the greatest missionaries of the early church. So Jesus' friends and even an enemy saw him alive after his death. Oh, and then Paul suffered and died for his belief as well. So not only did he claim to see this, but just like the disciples, he really believed it because he suffered and died willingly for his belief. Fact number 4 is the conversion of the skeptic James. James, Jesus' brother, half-brother, did not believe in Jesus during his ministry, his earthly ministry. James is not one of the 12. And yet later we find James is actually the head of the church in Jerusalem, right? So James is right up there with these apostles in proclaiming the Christian faith. But he didn't believe in Jesus during his early ministry while he was still alive on earth. Now, think about this. If you have a brother or a sister, how much evidence would it take for you to believe that your brother or sister was God incarnate, right? Maker of heaven and earth. That would be a pretty tough sell, yeah? So we can understand why James would be so hesitant, would be so skeptical of Jesus' messianic claims, of his divine authority, of his own brother being divine. But we see that James became a Christian. He became a Christian, and then we see in this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that James saw Jesus. The creed says that Jesus appeared to James. And so this early creed mentions how Jesus appeared to all these different people, even to 500 people at once, and James is one of them too. Again, just like the disciples, the original disciples, and Paul, James died for his belief as well. So it makes it very, very credible because, again, nobody will die for what they know is a lie. Fact number 5. This one is granted by about 75% of scholars, but still the overwhelming majority. So first, the Jerusalem factor. Here's one reason why so many scholars hold to this. Jesus was executed, and then the resurrection reports went out in Jerusalem. This was not that far away from one, where Jesus was executed, and two, right there where the empty tomb was. If anyone wanted to disprove this whole Jesus movement's, bringing resurrection into the story, all they had to do is go and show Jesus' body was still in the tomb. This was not miles and miles away from where Jerusalem was. People could easily access this tomb. It would have been impossible for Christianity to even get up off the ground if there was anybody in this tomb, right? Because people could just say, look, the body is still in the tomb, it's not empty. But according to Luke, the disciples were publicly proclaiming Jesus' resurrection about 50 days after his crucifixion. And so the body would still be intact. They could still show that the body was in the tomb and say, look, these guys are lying. The body of Jesus is still in the tomb. But they didn't do that. Instead, Jesus' enemies didn't deny it. By saying that the disciples stole the body, what they're implicitly saying is that there's no body in the tomb, right? So now we have to make up a reason for why there's no body in the tomb. So they said the disciples stole the body. Finally, we have the testimony of women. Now, this actually fits into the criteria of embarrassment, because why would you make up a story in the first century that was already hard to believe, a resurrection, a physical resurrection? Why would you make that up and have women be the first witnesses on the scene? In the first century, women were not looked very highly upon in terms of being witnesses. And so why would you make up that women were the first ones on the scene to witness the empty tomb? Because it just makes it a tougher sell for the original audience. Why make the Christian message harder to believe? No, the women are in the story because they're actually in the story. So the testimony of women is another piece of data that points to the fifth fact, the empty tomb. It's pretty unlikely that people who wrote the Gospels would make up the fact that women were the first witnesses on the scene. The only reason you'd report it like that is because it actually happened like that. So if you have to respond to naturalistic objections about the resurrection, I suggest using the minimal facts. Just cycle through the facts in your head and see which one doesn't fit. Just choose one that doesn't fit, and then use that as a conversation piece so you have a few talking points. In my conversation with this relative at the family gathering, the Easter gathering, I just cycled through my 5 minimal facts after she said, the resurrection story just emerged decades and decades and decades later because there were a bunch of Jewish peasants who felt like underdogs and they needed a Messiah figure to make them feel better about themselves. Well, I just cycled through the facts and I just immediately landed on Paul. I thought, well, first of all, Paul didn't miss Jesus. Paul didn't feel better emotionally when he was tortured, when he was persecuted for his faith in Christ. And Paul, if you recall, became a Christian 2 years after the cross. He already had this resurrection understanding because he would have to know about the resurrection theology to understand what he was seeing on the Damascus Road. And beyond that, even before this, he knew about the resurrection theology because that was the movement he was persecuting. He was persecuting people who said that Jesus was vindicated by God and that he rose from the dead. So this idea that the story of Jesus' resurrection emerged decades and decades later just doesn't work. And the Apostle Paul is a great person to talk about in that regard. Thanks for joining us for this conversation on the minimal facts approach.